Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to the fourth week of our Conlang workshop series. I just want y'all to give yourselves a tap on the back because we've breezed through all that grammar, all that really difficult part of conlanging, and now it's going to get much easier from here. So don't worry. If you felt lost last week, don't worry about it now because it's all going to be chill. This is where we're at currently. We finished the first 3 weeks. We finished talking about conlangs, and then we work on the sounds of your conlang, and then we worked on the rest of your grammars. So you learned about morphology, you learned about syntax. And today we're going to get into writing. It's going to be a pretty short workshop today since writing is kind of a small topic. So we're first going to get into orthography. What is orthography? What are writing systems? And we're going to get to glyphs and graphemes. And after that, we're going to talk about the types of writing systems. So how do languages write, basically? Right off the bat, we're going to talk about our task for this week, where you're going to build your conlangs orthography. So maybe you have your own writing system in mind, you have your own alphabet idea, or maybe you just want to use an existing one. Maybe you also just want to use the Latin alphabet. So we're going to talk about more of that in the third part of this workshop. And we're going to do something a little different today. So right after the workshop, I am going to host a progress and feedback session. If you want to hear feedback about your conlanging process throughout this workshop series, I'll discuss what you've gone through so far, and I'll perhaps even make suggestions for you to continue building your conlang onward. Now that we've gotten through a bulk of your conlang's grammar, or maybe you're still working on your grammar today, it's perfectly fine. There's a resource called ConWorkShop, very appropriately named. I know no language cafe is not connected to this website, but this website called ConWorkShop is specifically made for conlangs, and you could use it to log your conlangs. You have tools to set up a phonology and orthography. You could create grammar tables. You could log words into a dictionary. You could translate phrases and text, and you could even write articles about your conlang or anything related to your conlang. Let me just show you the website real quick because it's pretty handy. So this is what the homepage looks like. I'm in my Conlang Castilian. If you have multiple, you could always switch. I really find the dictionary section pretty handy. It kind of gives you a pronunciation as well. You could check your phonology. You could select sounds. If you have a writing system, you could upload a font and set up your orthography. Again, we'll talk more about orthography. And you could also check other conlangs. So if you click up the top page, it's going to show featured conlangs. I think conlangs, the website will allow conlangs to translate the homepage's title once it gets to a certain amount of words. So for example, this is Yokolta. I actually worked with Yokolta a bit because we had to share a writing system, but it looks like they changed the writing system. So that's cool. You could make a description for your conlang, a sample text, use their phonology, very big phonology, and this is the orthography section, which shows their alphabet or the writing system. So if you are interested in making an account in ConWorkShop, it's totally free. And if you are interested in making a conlang, I did create a clan for us to be in. So they have these things called clans, they're essentially just like groups. It's called Language Cafe Conlang Workshop. At the moment, there's nothing in here. I'm still figuring out what to do with the clan. Maybe I could post articles, or maybe after the workshop series, we could have some drills we could do, like translation drills, or we could write more about our conlang. I might even use it for the last task of the Conlang workshop series, but I still have to brainstorm it a bit. You join this through request. So if you scroll down to browse clans, you first go to community and then people and clans, and then go to clans. And then you could either join a clan freely. So some clans are open. Some clans are joined by request. So you have to request for it. For ours, you do have to request it. So please tell me your username if you create a ConWorkShop account. And some are just invite only. So like the American League, I cannot join that. It's a pretty handy website. I will say, depending on what you want to do for your conlang, it might be limiting to some extent. Like for me, I had trouble making a Romance language a posteriori conlang because it's kind of hard to work on different environments for how the letter C is pronounced, how the letter G is pronounced, etc., etc. But overall, I highly recommend this website. It's pretty handy. If you don't like staring at a spreadsheet for hours and hours while you make your conlang, this might be the tool for you. I will link all of these links in the conlang table, by the way, once I post the task. Let's get into the deets of this workshop. So first of all, what is writing? Well, writing is a method of visually representing a language without the need for you to use your vocal tract, or without the need for gestures if you're talking about sign languages. And people tend to think that writing is language. Well, in fact, it's not actually a part of a language's structure or grammar. Linguists don't necessarily look at writing. We look at sounds or gestures, and we look at how these sounds come together, but we don't look at how people write. And this is because it's more so a medium in which language is expressed expressed rather than language itself. And this is also a consciously created medium. So people were aware that they are creating writing. And the rules that govern writing in each language, we call this orthography. In the Conlang community, the word orthography and writing system are somewhat used interchangeably. I'm definitely using these terms interchangeably in this workshop, but generally orthography tends to refer to the rules specifically, while the writing system just may refer to the overall look of the writing system or how things are written generally. So how are glyphs written? And glyphs are marks or symbols that represent sounds or gestures, again, if you're talking about sign language. And within a glyph, you could have graphemes. So graphemes are the smallest unit of a writing system which forms a glyph. Let's go back to morphology. So you could think of a word, and within the word, you could have one or more morpheme. And it's kind of like this in orthography. You could have a glyph, and within that glyph, the glyph could constitute different graphemes. So it can stand alone, such as these two letters, A and E in the Latin alphabet, or this ta in Tibetan, or this character for languages that use the Chinese writing system. Or it could be attached to other graphemes. So it's possible that a grapheme cannot stand alone. If you look at these two dots, we call this an umlaut or a diaresis, and it rests above the A, the E, and the letter Y in some languages. So this A with an umlaut, we could call this one single glyph containing two graphemes, the A and the diacritic, this diaresis. And when we express writing, especially when we express it next to a phonetic transcription or a phonological transcription, you may see it written in between angle brackets like this. Let's do a deep dive in the types of writing systems. There are many different ways of expressing sound in writing. And today, a very common way is the use of an alphabet. So specifically, a true alphabet is where each grapheme or each glyph represents both vowels and consonants. So in an alphabet, vowels and consonants are expressed in the same or similar ways. So if you look over here, we have the Latin alphabet, and we have different symbols of almost equal height, and each one can either represent a consonant or a sound. In some alphabets, you could have individual symbols that represent multiple sounds or a cluster of sounds. So take the English word exam. When we write it, we use the letter X. It's supposed to produce a x sound or x, like in here, exam. In the Cyrillic alphabet, for example, it's used by Russian, there are some letters that represent a glide and a vowel. So take the word yak, for example, which means yak. So this R looking letter, ya, it's representing two phonemes, the y and the a, ya. You could also have multiple symbols. So you could have a set of glyphs representing a single sound. Like in English, we have the word moon. To produce that oo sound in the word moon, we use two O's. Or take the Greek word ble, which means blue. To write the b sound, we use the letter mi and the letter p together. So that creates the b or mb sound. And you could also have letters representing different sounds depending on its context. So take the GH cluster, for example, in English. We all know that it can be used to represent a whole lot of different sounds, like in through. It seems like it's not even pronounced in the word through. It just represents nothing. Or the word tough, it represents a labiodental fricative. Or in the word fight, we see that it kind of has some kind of effect on the I letter. Or the word ghost, it's just a velar plosive. Or take the French letter for example. In English, we call this E. In French, it's called So sometimes it's not even pronounced, like in médecin. Or sometimes it's like a schwa type of sound, like a mid-central vowel, like in de. Sometimes it's an open mid vowel, like belle. Or sometimes it's even more closed, like a closed mid vowel, like ave, ave. So another common alphabet is Cyrillic. Cyrillic is used in many Slavic languages, many Turkic languages as well, also used in Mongolian. And here we have Cyrillic used for the Macedonian language, which is another Slavic language. So as you could see, each letter or each grapheme or each glyph represents a specific vowel or a specific consonant. Now there's another type of common writing system called an Abjad. And this is where consonants are written, but vowels are not. The reader determines what the vowels are based on context. So take this sequence of glyphs, for example, in Arabic, j, m, l. You could pronounce it as jamal, camel, or you could change the vowel from a to u, jumal, which means to sum up. They're written the exact same way without the vowels. They just represent the consonants, and the vowels are inferred based on context. Here's another Abjad, which is the Phoenician script. Phoenician is an old Afro-Asiatic language. So if you read this, it's a glottal stop and a velar fricative. So if you pronounce this as ah. So if you put an ah vowel in between these consonants, it means brother. But if you say ahi, it means my brother. And these are written the exact same way again, because they're only representing the consonant sounds. Vowels are secondary. So here's a better look into Phoenician. As you could see, each glyph represents a single consonant. Necessarily see vowels represented on its own. Now, if you have a symbol that represents both a consonant and a vowel, or like a cluster of sounds, you could say it's a syllabary. So it represents either a syllable or a part of a syllable. So the Japanese language is well known for using two syllabaries. So one of them is hiragana, which is specifically used for native words in Japanese rather than loan words, which uses another type of syllabary. So take this word, for example, gomen nasai, which means I'm sorry. Each syllable or each part of a syllable is represented by its own glyph. So it's either the nucleus only or the onset and the nucleus. You could recall those terms from our second workshop. The Cherokee language spoken in the United States also uses a syllabary. For example, in this word askitiste, onset and nucleus combinations have their own symbol. And we also see this S that acts as a coda having its own symbol. A syllabary doesn't have to represent the entire syllable. It could represent just a part, more commonly the onset and nucleus. And here's a deeper look into Cherokee syllabary. So it's grouped into what the vowels are, so what the nucleus is, represented by columns. And if you look at the rows, it determines the onset or the first consonant of that syllable. Another type of writing system is Abugida. So this is a bit more complex, and this is where you have a base glyph representing a consonant or some type of consonant-vowel combination. But to change the nucleus in that syllable, you add additional parts around that glyph, or you change the glyph a bit in some way. And you could do this in many ways. You could use diacritics, so you could put a symbol above, below, left, right of, or around the symbol, or you could maybe change its shape, but still keep that general form. So an abugida I really love referencing is baybayin, which was used for some Philippine languages, such as Tagalog. And it's a pretty simple abugida. I like referencing it because it's one that kind of shows the rules of an abugida pretty clearly. So each glyph represents the onset, so the onset consonant, and the vowel a. So we have ba, da, ha, ma, na. If you want to change that nucleus into, let's say, an e or e, you add a dot on top. If you want to change it to an o or u, you add a dot below. If you just want to keep the consonant, maybe you're using it as a coda. If you want to change ba to b, you just add a cross below the glyph or the grapheme. So take this Tagalog word panlipunan, which means societal. Each onset and nucleus combination is represented by its own glyph, pa, li, pu, na. And we also have the coda consonant, the n, represented by a na written with a cross below. So it's keeping the same form, it's keeping the same shape of the glyph. It's just adding additional parts to it to change that nucleus. But the consonant remains the same generally. So another pretty fun abugida is inuktitut or inuktitut syllabics. And the way they change vowels is that they rotate the base glyph. They rotate the base grapheme. So if you look over here, B, it looks like an upwards pointing symbol. If you want to change it to pu, you rotate it clockwise. And if you want to change it to pa, you rotate it counterclockwise. So take this word, for example, nunavimmiot, which means person from Nunavut. There are two instances of coda consonants here, and t, and these are represented by taking the pa, the a vowel form of that grapheme, and making it a superscript, like in here. But otherwise, the onset and nucleus combinations are generally represented by their own symbol. And I would say an even more complex writing system is what we call a logography. So that's where each word or morpheme is represented with its own glyph or its own grapheme. And we call these logograms or logographs. So a really very commonly used one is the Chinese writing system. For example, it's used in Mandarin. So each syllable or each word, each morpheme has its own symbol. So there's thousands of symbols used in Mandarin. And in Mandarin specifically, we call these characters. Another one, a Conlang example is Sitalenpona. If you remember from the first workshop, we talked about Tokipona. And because of its small inventory of words, because of its small lexicon, people have created a logographic system because that would probably be a practical way of expressing that language in writing. So we call this Sitalenpona. And these are 120 words. So I think this is like 90% or more than 90% of their vocabulary, actually. That was a pretty short workshop. Now we're going to get into the task. The task for this week is that you're going to develop your Conlang's orthography. First, decide if your Conlang Conlang is even going to be written at all. Or like if you're trying to world build, is your Conlang going to have a written form? Is it not? Some Conlangs don't have an actual written orthography, like Dothraki, for example, in Game of Thrones. But some do, like High Valyrian or Klingon, as far as I can remember. So how does your Conlang look in writing, if it has writing? So how do supposed speakers of your Conlang express the language in writing, if they use writing at all? Does your Conlang use an existing orthography? So does it use the Latin alphabet? Does it use a Cyrillic alphabet? Does it use some type of other writing system that exists on Earth? And if so, what script does it use and what are its rules? So if it uses the Latin alphabet, how does it use the Latin alphabet to express sounds? But if it has its own writing system, if you're creating a writing system for it, what type of writing system does it use? So does it use an alphabet, an Abjad, an Abugida, Syllabary, a Logography? Does it maybe use a mix of these two writing systems, or does it use a mix of multiple writing systems? And to show the rules of your orthography, show us some charts or sample words to demonstrate orthographic rules. So some things you want to consider when you are making an orthography is first, what is the writing direction? So is it read left to right, like the Latin alphabet? Is it read right to left, like the Arabic script? Do you read it top to bottom, like in old Chinese texts? Or maybe you could try doing a bottom to top form of writing system. It's very rare. Or are there multiple writing directions in different contexts? Or do you use a mix of writing directions in the same passage? Does your writing system use spaces? And if so, how does it use spaces? Japanese doesn't really use spacing in the writing. Mandarin doesn't really use spacing in the writing. The Thai language, you don't really see spaces in between words, but you do see spaces in between sentences. How are spaces used if you are using spaces? How does punctuation look? Is punctuation used? And what do they separate? So in Thai, as far as I know, some punctuation marks aren't as used that much. Like sometimes the period is not used. The spaces could pretty much delineate sentences. But if you do have punctuation, what do they represent? For example, in the Latin alphabet, we have question marks. They kind of have that like intonational effect, or they represent an interrogative question. So what kind of tone does a punctuation give, if it even does that? And how do you represent prosody if you do want to represent it? How are things like vowel length or gemination represented? How is tone represented, if it's even represented? So like in Hausa language, Hausa exhibits tone, but you don't see it represented in writing. Whereas in Vietnamese, it has tone and you do see it in writing as diacritics. How is stress represented? The way English uses the Latin alphabet is that it doesn't represent stress at all. It's something you determine through context. But in the Greek alphabet, in modern Greek, you tend to see stress represented with a diacritic. Is intonation represented? A lot of languages don't necessarily represent intonation, but maybe you could try doing this. How are prosodic elements represented if you want to represent them? So these are just additional things to consider aside from the actual graphemes when you want to make your own writing system. So here's the writing system I developed for my Conlang in this workshop. I wanted to make an abugida. I have different graphemes here representing a base consonant, and they kind of go with the vowel a at base form. So va, ma, ba, la, sa. Something else I did is that if there's a voiced, unvoiced pair, so like la and sha or da and ta, it uses the same glyph, except it attaches a bar next to where you end. So we have ya and we have sha. And I paired this as voiced and unvoiced pairs because I feel like they're pretty close in place of articulation, even though the manner of articulation is quite different. This one's more turbulent, this one's more like a glide. And here we have vowels. Vowels change depending on what mark you put either at the top or bottom. So to make an e, just add this little stroke, and o is basically an e with an additional stroke. And to represent I and u, you do the same as a and o, except you add a stroke in the middle of the grapheme. So you have ma, me, mo, and m, mi, mu. Some of these graphemes end at the top part rather than the bottom. To add vowels to that, you just put it on top. So for example, to write ne, instead of the bar going at the bottom, you put it at the top. So ne, no. But for ne, ni, nu, and nu, it's pretty much the same rules. For example, you want to write the sound de. So take da, and then you add a bar here, de. And that's going to look a lot similar to ta. So how would speakers of my Conlang differentiate that? It may be that the e descends a bit lower. So de might be a bit more raised than ta. But I feel like if the speakers of a Conlang, for example, maybe they're writing pretty quickly, they may look the same. They may just appear the same way. I'm kind of vibing with that because I kind of like that ambiguity my writing system gives. So you could read something in different ways depending on its context. Diphthongs are represented in similar ways to vowels, is that it also uses the a character. So if you want to say ma, you take the ma and then you add a, but you add the e descender. It extends to that onset consonant. Same goes with mai, mau, and mau. The difference between ma and mai or mao and mau is that this line bridges the base consonant and the a letter. For moi and meo, it uses its own special attachments to the base consonant. So moi, it creates an o vowel and then it leads on to an a. And for meo, it's the same, except there's also this attaching line here. For mea, moa, mua, mia, and mua, you use the same rules as these vowels. You simply add the a next to the consonant. But specifically for mea, mia, and mua, you make the line extend to that a letter. Okay, so again, in my conlang, the syllable rule is that it can start with at most 3 consonants. It could even start with 2 consonants as an onset. There could be a coda, but if there is, it could only be 1 consonant. So how is this represented? And you simply just take the a form, so the base form of the consonant, and you attach it either left or right. So take the word bith, for example, which means floor. So you take b and you just add tha. So you may read this as bitha instead of bith, but really whether the consonant is the coda of a syllable or not, you determine that entirely through context. So it's up to the reader to determine whether this is bith or bitha. Or take the word stoaga, oven. So here's sa and here's o and ga. You may read this as stoag. Generally, if the consonant is e or o, it may be easier to read which is an onset or which is a different syllable because the e and o will tend to extend to the other consonants. So take this word zbzeta, which means tablet, writing tablet. So the e kind of encompasses all these 3 consonants here. And here's what a sentence looks like in my conlang. So for punctuation, there is space and each sentence is delineated using these brackets. So each sentence goes within these brackets. So uyenem dodonuk letuf. The children want to speak to the men. So you have uyenem, you read this left to right, and dodonuk dletuf. And here the dle part in dletuf, the e extends to the da. So you know this is not da letuf. And yeah, that's pretty much what I have for my writing system for now, at least. So any questions so far? Again, that was a super short workshop. Process of forming words. I am gonna get a bit more into this in the next workshop when we put our conlangs into context and when we talk about like maybe how words are formed, because sometimes you do see trends in different languages as to how words are made. If you look at words for parents, for example, or like mom and dad or mother and father, you do see that at least one of them has some kind of labial consonant because that's the first sound babies make. So you may follow some general trends as to how words are formed. You could even follow onomatopoeia. So like if I have a cat and I want to translate cat in my conlang, maybe I'll make it like meow or something. Mandarin does that, and I think ancient Egyptian. But otherwise, for pretty much other words, it's whatever comes out of my mouth. There isn't like an exact rigid process as to how I make words. Just pair sounds together and choose whatever I find appealing. So again, I'm trying to capture my subjective vibe of my conlang. But yeah, you could just write whatever comes out of your mouth. And if you're having trouble determining what words to translate, you could use the Swadesh list as a base. The Swadesh list is like pretty much very basic words like pronouns, some things like walk, run, or body parts like eye, hand, head, etc., etc. I linked it in the Conlang channel once, but I'll try to link it again, just in case you're kind of stuck in what words to translate. Consonants without that inherent vowel, if you just want to say b without the a, it's just written the same way. Like in this word bith, which means floor, you could either read this as bith or bitha. And the way you read it depends entirely on context. And sometimes it's not even a word at all. So like there isn't really a word that's bitha, but you know that bith is a word. So you read this as bith. But it depends on the reader. It's pretty ambiguous. I love ambiguity. How I match up. Okay, I could talk about that process because I did have kind of a process. So for me personally, I'm kind of making this writing system out in the blue. Like I'm not basing it off of another writing system. So what I did is that it's something in writing systems that we call featural, in that you see either place of articulation or manner of articulation being featured in the same kind of light. So take these first 3 sounds, va, ma, and ba. These are all labial sounds and they kind of have a roof at the top and they're open at the bottom. Ba, ma, and ba. So ma has 1 curl, ba has 2 curls. And if you take na, da, and ta, it's the exact same thing, except you just flip it. So na has 1 curl, da has 2 curls. And la, it's kind of in contrast to va. So the amount of curls kind of shows how constricted the airflow is. But yeah, labial consonants have a similar shape, that alveolar consonants have a similar shape. You also see featural systems in Korean, for example, like ka, ka, a. It looks like similar symbols, or like ba, pa, like those consonants like ma. They have similar symbols as well. So they're similar in place of articulation. For some writing systems, it looks pretty random. Like let's go back to the Latin a bit. Like this looks entirely random because because this underwent like years and years of evolution and borrowing from other writing systems. So the Latin alphabet, you could actually trace it back to the Phoenician Abjad, like here. And even the Phoenician Abjad looks pretty random. And that's because these symbols are based on some kind of older like logographic form. That's why Alap is like ox, because it used to look like an ox head, etc., etc. Or if you take like Mandarin or like the Chinese writing system, it's based on a much older logographic form called the Oracle Bone Script. And when you look at that, it looks pretty much the same as how you would picture the morpheme. So I think like zhi, which means sun and day. To me, this looks nothing like the sun. But if you look at the Oracle Bone Script form, it'll look more like the sun. Or like yue moon. Kind of looks like a crescent, but not really now because it underwent like centuries of evolution. So you could think about how your writing system evolved if you are making a writing system. But otherwise, it's also perfectly fine to like just make random symbols and just pair them up with consonants or pair them up with vowels. It's totally fine. So yeah, it's kind of a mix of strategy and vibe. A lot of the conlanging process is entirely based on vibe. It's very subjective. You tend to follow your conlang based on like your own biases. You kind of determine like rules based on how you like it. And I guess for newbies, you're kind of just exploring. I know a lot of newbies, and when I was a newbie, a lot of the vibes came from my own native languages. So I looked a lot at English. I looked a lot at Tagalog. You tend to make an English looking conlang or like a conlang that looks like your native language at first. But I think as you explore more languages, like more natural languages, then you might develop more of what vibe you want to go for. You might have like a better idea. So I do highly suggest like exploring other natural languages and then also exploring other conlangs as well. How you put your custom alphabet into Oh, so we talked about like adding an orthography in ConWorkShop. And if you do want to add your language to ConWorkShop and you have your own writing system, that's something you want to consider. You will have to make your own font for it. There's many tools. A lot of the good ones are not free. So you will have to learn a bit more about making fonts and like working with like vectors because it's a bit hard. There is an online tool called Fontstruct that I used. It's an online tool where you can make your own fonts. I made a lot of abandoned writing systems on this. And the way it works is that, here, let me open this. You kind of put shapes into grids. When you download it, it'll save it a font file. It's pretty simple. So when you go to ConWorkShop, you go to orthography and go to conscript, and then you upload your font file here. And you could add rules. For example, like let's say you're making an abugida, and you know in an abugida that you want to attach vowels to like the base consonant. It'll be a little hard to make a font for that. Or like if you're making like a syllabary, you can't just like make your own Unicode characters. You have to use existing Unicode characters and make a font for it. So you could add rules as to how your font is going to appear or how the writing system will appear when it translates the Latin text into your font. And they use a thing called FOMO. It kind of uses the same notation as like when you're trying to express sound changes. So you will have to learn about how FOMO works. It's pretty simple. This is what FOMO looks like. So let's take the word tahama. You want to replace all A's with E. So A/E. So your input and then slash output becomes taheme. Generally, you use this for phonology or use it for like adding suffixes or prefixes or affixes to your words. But in the conscript page, you could also use FOMO rules. You could use it to add rules to your writing system. I have a specific syllable called va, and I'm using the capital V to represent va. I would probably do va/v. So it changes all instances of va and it changes to v. So when it renders in the font, it's going to look like the character I created for va. If you are considering adding your own font or your own writing system, I recommend reading the FOMO rules as well. If there's no other questions, then we can end the workshop here. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you. I'm sorry for using the same language 3 times. I promise the Conlang will switch in the next workshop, but thank you. Thank you very much.